The letter came in a plain envelope, sitting on top of a stack of old paper files nobody had touched in years. Ben Calder found it on his desk on an ordinary afternoon, next to a cold cup of water and a stapler that never worked right. He almost missed it under the pile of forms. He worked in the diplomatic archive office, a small room 3 floors below the people who actually made decisions. His job was to sort old records that nobody wanted to read anymore. It was not a job people bragged about at parties. It paid enough, kept him busy, and most days that was fine with him. He had stopped expecting anything more from life a long time ago. The letter told him he had been chosen to represent Earth before the ancient AI known as the Keeper. At first he thought it was a mistake. He read it twice, then a third time, checking the name at the top. Ben Calder. His name, spelled correctly, sitting under an official government seal. There was no mistake. He had been picked. Word spread fast once the announcement went public. Every screen on the planet carried the same story within hours. Humanity's chosen envoy to the most important meeting in its short history as a spacefaring species was a records clerk nobody had ever heard of. The galactic news networks, run by species far older and far more powerful than Earth, found it endlessly funny. Comedy shows made jokes about him within a day. Strangers on the street recognized his face and laughed before they even said hello. Ben understood, in a quiet and painful way, exactly what had happened. Humanity had only recently been given a small, weak seat at the edge of galactic society, called provisional status. To move past that and become a full member, every new species had to send someone to be judged by the Keeper, an old machine intelligence that lived inside a structure called the Cradle. No living being fully understood what happened during that judgment. Some species sent their best generals. Others sent scholars who had studied for 100 years. Whoever was chosen carried the weight of their entire species on their shoulders. Earth had sent him, a man who filed paperwork for a living, a man who had never held a weapon, never given a speech to more than 10 people, never done anything anyone would call important. He was not stupid. He knew a rigged lottery when he saw one, even without proof. The system that picked names for the mission had been influenced from somewhere outside Earth's control, somewhere higher up in the council structure, and the fingerprints on it led toward the Kesh Assembly, the strongest voice in galactic politics. Ambassador Doran, the Kesh delegate who spoke for the Old Order, had been vocal for months about how unready humanity was for a real seat at the table. A clerk stumbling through the judgment, failing in front of the whole galaxy, would prove Doran's point better than any speech ever could. Commander Ryan Ostrander, who ran what little defense fleet Earth had, stormed into the review meeting the moment he heard the news. He argued for hours that the selection should be overturned, that sending an untrained civilian into a test nobody understood was reckless at best. He was told, politely but firmly, that the lottery had been conducted according to agreed rules, and reversing it now would look worse than letting it stand. Doran's people had planned well. There was no clean way out. Ryan found Ben later that evening in the archive office, still sitting at his desk, staring at nothing in particular. "You don't have to go," Ryan said. "There are ways around this. I can push harder." Ben shook his head slowly. "If I refuse, they win anyway. Earth backs down, looks weak, looks scared. If I go and fail, they win too. Either way, they win. Might as well go." Ryan didn't have an answer for that, because it was true, and they both knew it. The one person who did not treat the situation as a disaster, she met Ben the morning before departure, in a small waiting room near the transport hangar. She was carrying a worn case full of old notes and photographs, and she looked at him not with pity, the way most people did now, but with something closer to curiosity. "Everyone keeps telling me you're a joke," she said, sitting down across from him. "I don't think that's true. I think you're the first interesting thing that's happened to this program in years." Ben gave a tired half-smile. "Careful. That kind of talk could get you laughed at too." "I've been laughed at by better people than these delegates," she said simply, and opened her case, showing him pages covered in strange symbols pulled from stone walls buried under Earth's oldest cities, symbols nobody had ever managed to translate. He didn't understand why she was showing him this, and she didn't explain it fully, only saying that something about the mission felt important in a way the council hadn't accounted for. He didn't believe her, not really. He believed he was walking into a very public and very humiliating failure, and that the best he could do was face it without making things worse for the people back home who still had to live under whatever judgment came next. That night, packing the single bag he was allowed to bring, Ben looked out his small apartment window at the sky, thinking about how strange it was that his life had been ordinary for 34 years and was about to become anything but. He did not know what was waiting for him inside the cradle. He only knew that in a few days, the whole galaxy would be watching to see how badly he failed, and there was no version of the future he could imagine where that didn't happen exactly as everyone expected. He was wrong, though he had no way of knowing it yet. Grace kept a photograph in her jacket pocket, folded so many times the creases had turned white. It showed a wall of carved stone, half buried in red dirt, covered in symbols that matched nothing in any known language on Earth. She had taken that photograph 11 years ago, on the first dig that made her question everything she thought she knew about human history. She looked at it now, sitting in a narrow seat aboard the transport ship, while Ben slept a few rows away, exhausted from 3 days of press conferences and forced smiles. The ship carrying Earth's delegation was old, patched together from parts bought secondhand from 3 different alien shipyards, because Earth could not yet afford anything better. It rattled faintly whenever the engines shifted power, and the lights in the hallway flickered on a cycle nobody had bothered to fix. Outside, in near-perfect formation, 3 sleek observer vessels from rival species trailed behind them, close enough to be seen from the viewport, close enough to make their purpose obvious. They were not there for safety. They were there to watch. Ben woke somewhere around the 2nd day of travel and found Grace sitting across from him, still holding her photograph. "You should sleep," he said. "I don't sleep well on ships," she answered, not looking up. "Too much thinking time." He nodded toward the photograph. "What is that?" She hesitated, then handed it to him. "Found it in a cave system that predates every known human settlement by thousands of years. Nobody has ever translated the writing. Not fully. A few scattered symbols look almost familiar, like fragments of something older than any language we've cataloged, but the rest stays silent no matter what we try." Ben studied the shapes without understanding them, turning the photograph slightly in the dim cabin light. "Why does it matter now?" "Because whatever built the cradle disappeared around the same time these carvings were made," she said. "Give or take a few centuries. 7,000 years is a long stretch of silence for 2 things not to be connected." He handed the photograph back, unconvinced but polite about it. "I think you're looking for a story that isn't there. I'm not anyone special, Grace. I promise you that." She folded the photograph again, careful along the same worn lines. Maybe, or maybe nobody's had a real reason to look until now. Their conversation was cut short by an announcement over the ship's speakers, calling all envoys to the main gathering hall for a formal introduction before arrival. Ben straightened his jacket, the same plain gray jacket he had worn to a dozen government meetings back home, and followed Grace down the narrow corridor. The gathering hall was already half full when they arrived, and the difference between Ben and everyone else in the room was impossible to miss. A tall envoy from a species called the Havinar stood near the front, decorated in medals earned across 4 different wars, each one representing a battle that had shaped the fate of an entire star system. Beside him stood a scholar from a species so old its written records stretched back further than most planets had existed as inhabited worlds, carrying nothing but a small data crystal that reportedly held the complete history of her people. Every envoy in the room carried something, a title, an achievement, a reputation that had followed them across the stars. Ben carried a records badge from an office 3 floors below anyone who mattered. Ambassador Doran entered last, moving through the room with the practiced calm of someone who had already decided how this would end. He paused near Ben just long enough to be noticed by everyone watching, offering a small nod that looked polite on the surface and felt like something else entirely underneath. "Envoy Calder," Doran said, voice carrying easily across the hall. "I do hope you understand the weight of what awaits you. The Keeper does not offer second chances. Whatever happens in that chamber will be broadcast to every member species in the Council. Every failure, every stumble, all of it, permanent record." A few of the other envoys exchanged glances, some amused, some almost sympathetic. Ben kept his expression steady, though his stomach tightened. "I understand," he said simply. "I doubt that you do," Doran replied. and moved on without waiting for a response. Grace stepped closer once the ambassador had walked away. "Don't let him get to you." "I'm not," Ben said, though it wasn't entirely true. He had spent his whole life being overlooked, and there was a strange kind of comfort in being invisible. Being watched by an entire galaxy, waiting for him to embarrass an entire species, was something else entirely. The ship reached the edge of the dead system 3 hours later, and the viewports filled with a sight none of the envoys had ever witnessed in person. The cradle hung in silent orbit around a star that had burned out long before any human civilization existed, a structure so vast it seemed to swallow the darkness around it rather than sit within it. Its surface was smooth, black, and utterly without seams, as if it had been grown rather than built. No lights showed anywhere along its length. It looked less like a station and more like something that had simply always existed, patient and unmoving, waiting for visitors it had judged for thousands of years. Nobody in the gathering hall spoke for a long moment. Ben stared at it through the viewport, feeling smaller than he had ever felt in his life. And yet, for reasons he couldn't explain, something about the sight did not frighten him the way he expected it to. It felt, in some strange and quiet way, almost familiar. Grace noticed the look on his face and said nothing, but she reached into her pocket and touched the folded photograph once, like a woman checking that a key was still there before opening a door she had been waiting years to try. The first thing Ben noticed inside the cradle was not the light. It was the silence. It pressed against his ears the way deep water does, heavy and total, swallowing even the sound of his own footsteps the moment he crossed the threshold. The walls, if they could be called walls, curved upward into a darkness that seemed to have no ceiling at all, lit only by a faint silver glow with no visible source. The envoys were led one by one into a great open chamber at the center of the structure, where the judgment would take place. Everyone else waited outside in a smaller hall, watching the proceedings through a shared viewing screen, since only one envoy was permitted inside at a time. Ben stood near the back with Grace, watching the tall Havinar warrior go first. The warrior entered with confidence, chin high, metals catching the strange light. He spoke for nearly 10 minutes about his service, his victories, the sacrifices his people had made to earn their place among the stars. When he finished, there was a long pause. Then a voice, calm and enormous, seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Denied." No explanation followed. The warrior was escorted out, stunned into silence, his metals suddenly looking very small. One by one, the pattern repeated. The scholar with her data crystal spoke of her people's history for only 2 minutes before the same word ended her attempt. A diplomat from a species famous for its patience and wisdom lasted barely 90 seconds. Whatever the keeper was looking for, none of them seemed to have it, and each rejection landed heavier than the last, until the watching hall had gone almost completely silent. Ambassador Doran leaned toward Ben as his turn approached, a thin smile on his face. "I look forward to this," he said quietly. Ben walked into the chamber alone. The space inside was larger than it had appeared from outside, a vast circular room with a single point of light hovering at its center, pulsing faintly like something breathing. He stood there, feeling impossibly small, waiting for the same voice that had ended every attempt before his. Instead, the light shifted. Old systems around the chamber, dormant for longer than any living species could measure, began waking one by one. Panels along the curved walls lit up in slow, deliberate sequence, spreading outward from where Ben stood like ripples across still water. The air itself seemed to change, growing warmer, as if the room had been holding its breath for 7,000 years and had only just remembered how to exhale. Ben froze, unsure if this was part of the judgment or the beginning of something going very wrong. Then the voice spoke, and it was not the flat word that had dismissed every envoy before him. It was a name. A name Ben had never heard before in his life, spoken with a strange weight, each syllable carrying something that felt older than language itself. It did not match anything in any human record, any ancient text, any forgotten dialect Grace had ever shown him. And yet, standing in that chamber, hearing it spoken aloud for what felt like the first time in thousands of years, Ben felt something stir deep inside him that he had no words for, a recognition without memory, like hearing an old song from a life he had never lived. In the outer hall, every envoy watching the shared screen fell into stunned silence. Doran's smile vanished entirely. Grace stood frozen, staring at the screen, her hand pressed against her jacket pocket where the folded photograph waited. That name, she whispered to no one in particular. I've seen fragments of that name. Inside the chamber, the voice continued, softer now, almost gentle. You do not know this name, it said, not as a question, but as an observation. Ben found his own voice with difficulty. No, I don't. And yet you carry it, the keeper said. Buried, but present. As all your kind do, though none of you remember why. Ben's heart pounded. Every part of him wanted to ask 100 questions at once, but only one managed to escape. Who were you calling me? The light at the center of the chamber pulsed brighter, and for a moment Ben thought he saw shapes within it, fleeting and impossible to hold on to, like trying to remember a dream after waking. A name given long before your species scattered its memory across the stars and forgot where it began, the keeper said. A name lost when the ones who built this place chose silence over war and left behind only echoes for their descendants to stumble upon by accident. Descendants, Ben repeated, the word feeling strange in his mouth. You're saying humans are descendants of whoever built this place? I am saying, the keeper answered, that I have waited 7,000 years to say that name aloud again, and I did not expect to say it to someone who does not yet understand what he is. Outside the chamber, the shared screen showed Ben standing motionless beneath the pulsing light, and every envoy watching understood, in that moment, that whatever they had come expecting to witness, this was not it. Ambassador Doran's hands had curled into tight fists at his sides. Whatever plan had been set in motion to guarantee humanity's humiliation had just collided with something none of them had accounted for, something old and patient that had been waiting far longer than any political scheme could have anticipated. Grace finally exhaled the breath she hadn't realized she was holding, and turned to look at the frozen faces around her, delegates and warriors and scholars alike, all watching a records clerk from Earth stand at the center of a mystery none of them had ever imagined existed. He's not the joke, she said quietly, mostly to herself. He never was. Inside the chamber, the keeper asked its question, and the words settled over Ben like something heavy finally, set down after being carried too long. Do you know who you were? Ben had no answer, but for the first time since receiving that plain envelope on an ordinary afternoon, he understood that the question was not rhetorical, and that somewhere inside him, buried under 34 ordinary years, an answer was waiting to be found. Grace had spent 11 years chasing a story nobody else believed was real, and now she sat in a small side room off the main chamber, notebook open on her knees, hands trembling slightly as she copied down every word the council recorders allowed her to hear. The keeper had requested her presence directly, an unprecedented move that left the other delegates whispering among themselves, unsure whether to be offended or afraid. Ben sat across from her, still pale from what had happened inside the chamber, turning a small data tablet over in his hands without really looking at it. You said you'd seen fragments of that name, he said. Before today. Where? Grace flipped back through her notebook to a page covered in faded pencil sketches, copies she had made years ago from carvings half buried in red dirt on a dig site that had been shut down before she could finish her research. Here, and here. I never had enough of the language to be sure, but the shape of it always felt like more than decoration, like a signature repeated across different sites, thousands of miles apart, all roughly the same age. 7,000 years old, Ben said quietly. Give or take. Before either of them could say more, the keeper's voice returned, filling the small room the same way it had filled the great chamber, calm and unhurried despite the storm it had already caused among the watching delegates. You have both been looking for pieces of the same truth, it said, though neither of you understood how closely they were joined. Grace set down her pencil. Then tell us, please, what were you, before this place went silent? There was a pause, long enough that Ben wondered if the question had gone unanswered. Then images began to form along the walls of the small room, faint and shifting, built from light rather than any screen or projector Ben could identify. He saw glimpses of a civilization unlike anything in Earth's history books, cities built into the sides of mountains, vast fields of light stretching across worlds, and ships that moved without visible engines, gliding silently between stars. "We were many, once," the keeper said, "spread across 1,000 worlds, bound together by structures like this one, built to preserve what we valued most. Knowledge, memory, the right of every new people to be judged fairly before being welcomed among the stars." "What happened?" Ben asked. "War," the keeper said simply. "Not fought with weapons alone, though there were weapons enough to end worlds. Fought with forgetting. Entire populations chose silence rather than surrender what they believed in, scattering their descendants across distant systems, stripping away memory to protect what could not be allowed to fall into the wrong hands." Grace's pencil had stopped moving entirely. "You're saying humanity is one of those scattered populations?" "I am saying," the keeper answered, "that the bloodline carried by the one you call Ben Calder matches a genetic and cultural signature recorded here nearly 7,000 years ago, before the silence began. It is not the only such bloodline I have found among the stars, but it is the first I have found in a very long time." Ben felt the weight of every word settle over him differently than before. This was not simply about him, personally, being special. It was about an entire species, forgotten and scattered, and one small, unlikely thread connecting an ordinary records clerk to something ancient enough to have shaped the very structure that now decided the fate of new civilizations. The privacy of the room did not last long. Ambassador Doran arrived within the hour, accompanied by 2 other senior delegates from the Kesh Assembly, none of them bothering to hide their displeasure at being excluded from a conversation of this importance. "This is highly irregular," Doran said, stepping into the room without waiting for permission. "The judgment chamber is not meant for private theater. If claims are being made about ancestry, about bloodlines connected to this structure, they must be verified through proper council channels, not through unwitnessed conversation between a machine and 2 unqualified humans. The keeper has never required verification from outside sources in 7,000 years of judgment," Grace said, closing her notebook firmly. "Why start now?" "Because the implications are enormous," Doran snapped, some of his careful diplomatic calm slipping for the first time since Ben had met him. "If this claim is accepted, it changes everything about how the Council views humanity's standing. It changes voting weight. It changes resource allocation. It changes centuries of careful balance. It changes who has to share power," Ben said quietly, and the room went still. Doran's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, the keeper spoke again, its voice carrying an edge Ben had not heard before, something closer to old, tired patience finally running thin. "I have judged envoys for 7,000 years without interference from outside opinion," it said. "I will not begin allowing political convenience to shape truth now, simply because that truth is inconvenient for those who have grown comfortable with the current order." Doran's expression hardened into something colder, something calculating, and for a brief moment Ben saw past the practiced diplomat entirely, glimpsing someone far more dangerous underneath, someone who had just realized that words alone would not stop what was happening here. "Very well," Doran said, his voice tight. "Then let the record show the Kesh Assembly formally objects to these proceedings." He turned and left without another word, his 2 companions following close behind, but not before one of them glanced back at Ben with an expression that felt less like anger and more like a warning. Grace watched them go, then turned back to Ben, her earlier excitement now tempered with visible worry. "That wasn't an objection," she said quietly. "That was a threat." Ben nodded slowly, the strange comfort of finally understanding something about himself now tangled up with a new and colder fear. Whatever he had stumbled into went far deeper than a lost name and an old machine's memory. Somewhere outside this small room, powerful people had just decided that the truth he represented was dangerous enough to stop by any means necessary, and he had no idea yet how far they were willing to go to make sure it never reached the rest of the galaxy. A low tone began pulsing through the cradle's corridors sometime after the 2nd hour of Doran's departure, quiet at first, easy to mistake for background noise, then growing steadily more insistent until nobody inside the structure could ignore it any longer. Ben felt it before he understood what it meant, a faint tremor running through the floor beneath his feet, like something enormous shifting somewhere far below. Grace looked up sharply from her notebook. "That's not part of the judgment process." They were still in the small side room when Commander Ryan Ostrander burst through the doorway, breathing hard, his usual calm entirely gone. "We've got a problem. A big one. Kesh security vessels are moving into position outside the cradle, and something inside the structure just went dark on 3 separate levels below us." "Dark how?" Ben asked. "Power failures. Coordinated ones. This isn't an accident." Ryan's jaw was tight. "Somebody's trying to force an emergency shutdown before the Keeper finishes whatever it's doing with you." The Keeper's voice returned then, quieter than before, strained in a way that made Ben's stomach twist. "Core stability systems have been compromised. Someone has accessed maintenance pathways not opened since before the silence began. I am old, and this body is not what it once was. I cannot stop this alone." Grace was already on her feet. "Where do they need to go?" "Lower structure. Access point 7. The pathways will not be simple to navigate. Much of what remains down there has not been walked by any living being in thousands of years." Ben felt fear settle cold and heavy in his chest, but underneath it, something else stirred too, a strange determination he hadn't expected from himself. He had spent his whole life avoiding attention, avoiding risk, staying small and safe and forgettable. That version of himself did not seem to exist anymore, not after hearing his name spoken by something older than his entire species' recorded history. "Then let's go," he said, and was almost surprised by how steady his own voice sounded. Ryan handed him a small handheld light, the kind used for emergency repairs on Earth's own aging fleet. "Stay close. I don't know what's down there, and neither do you." The 3 of them moved quickly through corridors that grew darker with every level they descended. The smooth black walls of the cradle, now lit only by the beam of Ryan's light, and faint emergency strips flickering along the floor. Ben could feel the tremors growing stronger, more frequent, and somewhere far above them he thought he heard the distant, muffled sound of raised voices and alarms in the outer hall where the other envoys waited. Outside the structure, the standoff had already begun. Ryan's fleet, small and outdated compared to the sleek Kesh security vessels now closing in around the cradle, held position anyway, refusing to yield the narrow buffer of space between the structure and the approaching ships. It was not a fight Earth could win outright, and everyone watching from both sides knew it. But retreating now would mean abandoning Ben and Grace inside a structure that might not survive what was happening to it. Deep within the cradle, they reached Access Point 7, a wide chamber filled with towering columns of dark material humming faintly with residual power. At its center, a section of wall had been forced open, exposing ancient systems that had clearly been damaged deliberately. Wires and components pulled loose in a way that looked less like an accident and more like careful, targeted sabotage. "Someone knew exactly what to break," Grace said, crouching beside the damage. "The Kesh have studied this place for decades," the Keeper said, its voice now coming from a small emitter embedded in the nearby wall, weaker than before. "Doran's people have always sought access they were never granted. It seems patience finally gave way to desperation." Ben knelt beside the exposed systems, staring at the strange components, feeling completely out of his depth. He was a records clerk. He filed paperwork. He had no idea how to fix ancient alien technology thousands of years beyond anything humanity had ever built. And yet, as his hand hovered near the damaged panel, something happened that he could not explain. A faint warmth spread through his fingers, and the components nearest his hand seemed to respond. Faint lights flickering back to life along pathways that had gone dark moments before. "What is that?" Ryan said quietly, staring. "Instinct," the Keeper answered, before Ben could form a question of his own. "Buried deep, inherited rather than learned. Your bloodline was bound to systems like this once. The connection remains, even after 7,000 years of forgetting." Ben didn't fully understand what was happening, but he stopped trying to understand it and simply moved, following an urge that felt more like memory than guesswork, reconnecting torn pathways, guided by something ancient and quiet inside himself he had never known was there. Grace worked alongside him, cross-referencing what she saw against the notes and photographs she had carried for over a decade, finally putting fragments of her life's work to direct use. It took nearly 20 minutes of careful, desperate work before the tremors finally began to ease, the low pulsing tone fading into silence, and the keeper's voice returned stronger than before, no longer strained. Core stability restored, it said. The sabotage has been recorded, time-stamped, and will be presented to the full council as evidence, alongside the identity of those responsible. Outside, the Kesh security vessels, suddenly exposed and without justification for their aggressive positioning, began pulling back under the watch of every other observer ship still recording the encounter. Whatever Doran had hoped to accomplish by force had instead handed the rest of the galaxy undeniable proof of exactly how far the Kesh assembly was willing to go to protect the current order. Ben sat back against the cool wall of the chamber, exhausted, his hands still faintly warm, and looked over at Grace, who was smiling for the first time since they had entered the cradle. "You did that," she said. "Not the keeper. You." Ben shook his head slowly, still trying to process what had just happened. "I don't even know what I did." "Doesn't matter," Ryan said, helping him to his feet. "It worked, and every delegate in this system just watched it happen." The great chamber looked different when Ben walked back into it for the second time, though nothing about its shape or size had changed. What had changed was the silence, which no longer felt cold and distant, and the light, which no longer felt like something judging him from a great height. It felt, strangely, like walking into a room that had been waiting a very long time for someone to finally come home. Every envoy from the outer hall had been gathered to witness the formal verdict, along with a wide circle of observer screens broadcasting the moment to every member world in the council, including Earth itself. Ben knew, somewhere in the back of his mind, that people back home were watching this exact moment unfold. People who had laughed at his selection only days earlier. People who had no idea yet how much everything was about to change. Ambassador Doran stood near the front of the gathered delegates, flanked by two council security officers rather than his usual aides. The footage from the sabotage attempt had already been reviewed by the full council during the hours it took to stabilize the cradle, and the evidence had left no room for argument. Doran's face was carefully composed, but the tightness around his eyes told a different story, one of a plan that had collapsed entirely under its own weight. The keeper's voice filled the chamber once more, steady now, fully restored. The Kesh Assembly's actions during this judgment have been recorded and will be addressed through appropriate council process, it said. That matter is now closed for the purposes of today's proceedings. A murmur ran through the gathered delegates, quickly silenced as the light at the center of the chamber pulsed and brightened, drawing every eye back to where Ben stood. "I have judged envoys from many species across 7,000 years, the keeper continued. Warriors, scholars, diplomats trained since childhood for exactly this moment. None of them carried what this one carries, not because he is more skilled, or more powerful, or more prepared than any who came before him, but because he carries something older than skill or preparation, a connection to what this place was built to protect." Ben felt every eye in the chamber turn toward him, and for once, the attention did not make him want to disappear. "Humanity's provisional status is hereby ended," the keeper said, not through the standard measure of readiness applied to new species, but through recognition of lineage. The bloodline carried within this envoy, and likely scattered throughout his species in ways not yet fully understood, traces directly to those who built this structure and the order it was meant to preserve. Earth is not simply ready to join the council. Earth is, in a sense that few living species can claim. The chamber fell into stunned quiet. Even the delegates who had shown Ben nothing but polite dismissal during the journey now looked at him with something entirely different, somewhere between disbelief and genuine wonder. As for the envoy himself, the keeper said, and its voice softened slightly, taking on something almost personal, "I have not spoken this name aloud in 7,000 years, believing it lost along with everything else the silence took from me. I did not expect to speak it again in this lifetime. I certainly did not expect to speak it to someone chosen as a joke by those who did not understand what they were mocking." Ben swallowed hard, feeling the weight of thousands of years settle gently rather than crushingly for the first time since this had all begun. "I still don't fully understand who I was," he said quietly, his voice carrying easily through the silent chamber. "But I think I understand a little better who I want to be now. That," the keeper said, "is more than most who came before you ever offered." The formal ceremony that followed felt almost unreal to Ben, a blur of council officials, updated status documents, and careful, newly respectful introductions from delegates who had barely acknowledged his existence 3 days earlier. Grace stood beside him through most of it, her worn photograph finally tucked safely away, her life's work no longer dismissed as an obsession but suddenly treated as vital research demanded by council scholars from a dozen different worlds. Ryan watched from a short distance, arms crossed, a small proud smile breaking through his usual serious expression as Earth's new status was formally recorded before the full council for the first time in the planet's short history among the stars. Later, once the chamber had cleared and the crowds of delegates had finally dispersed to spread the news across 100 worlds, Ben found himself standing alone before the central light one final time, the Keeper's presence still faintly humming through the quiet air. "What happens now?" Ben asked. "That," the Keeper answered, "depends entirely on what your people choose to become, now that the silence has finally been broken. I have watched empires rise from far less than what your species carries, and I have watched them fall from far more. History does not repeat itself gently, and I will not promise you an easy path." Ben looked up at the light, no longer feeling small beneath it the way he had the first time he entered this chamber. "Then I guess we'll have to earn it. Same as anyone else." "Perhaps," the Keeper said, something almost like warmth threading through its ancient voice. "Or perhaps you already began earning it, the moment you chose to walk into this chamber instead of turning away from a name you did not yet understand." Ben allowed himself a small, tired smile, thinking of the plain envelope that had started all of this, sitting forgotten on a desk 3 floors below where anyone important never looked. He thought of how easily this could have gone. Outside the cradle, humanity's ships held their place among the stars, no longer the smallest and least respected fleet in the system, but something the rest of the galaxy would now have to look at differently. And somewhere far below, deep within a structure older than recorded history, an ancient intelligence that had waited 7,000 years finally had a reason to wonder, with something close to hope, what the next chapter of an old, scattered, and long-forgotten people might finally become.